Eliza Hart had spent years alone in her small cabin on the edge of the Texas frontier. The land stretched out around her in every direction, vast and empty, a sea of grass and sky broken only by the occasional stand of trees or the distant silhouette of a wandering deer. She had come here with her husband long ago, full of hope and dreams, but life had a way of changing things. First, sickness took her parents back east. Then the war took her husband, leaving her with nothing but a quiet house and the echo of memories. Most days, the solitude did not bother her. She had learned to rely on herself, to hunt for food, to mend her own clothes, to keep the fire burning through the coldest nights. The land was harsh, but she was harsher, refusing to let it break her. Still, there were moments when the wind whistled through the cracks in the cabin walls, or when the coyotes howled in the distance that she wondered if this was how her life would always be. Just her, the endless prairie, and the silence. Then, one evening, the sky darkened in a way that made the hairs on her arms stand up. The air grew heavy, and thunder rolled across the land like the growl of some great beast. Eliza was stirring a pot of rabbit stew over the fire when she heard the sound of horses approaching. Not the slow, easy trot of a lone rider, but the quick, purposeful rhythm of many hooves. Her heart clenched tight in her chest. Visitors were rare and rarely good. She set down her wooden spoon and reached for the rifle leaning against the wall. Her fingers curled around the familiar weight as she stepped onto the porch, squinting into the fading light. 3 riders emerged from the gloom, their figures tall and imposing even from a distance. As they drew closer, she saw they were not settlers, not traders, not anyone she had seen before. They were Comanche warriors, their faces stern, their long hair braided, their bodies draped in hides and decorated with beads. The tallest of them guided his horse to a stop just beyond her porch. His dark eyes locked onto hers, unreadable but not unkind. "We need shelter," he said in rough but clear English. Eliza's grip tightened on her rifle. She knew the stories. The Comanche were fierce, untamed, not to be trusted. But the storm was coming fast, and the wind was already whipping the grass into a frenzy. She could turn them away, but something in the man's steady gaze made her hesitate. After a long moment, she stepped back and held the door open wider. "Come in," she said. And just like that, her quiet, solitary life was no longer hers alone. The moment the warriors stepped inside, Eliza's small cabin seemed to shrink. The air grew thick with the scent of rain, leather, and wood smoke. The tallest one, Kohana, took up so much space that his shoulders nearly brushed the doorframe as he entered. Tseena, the youngest, had sharp eyes that flicked around the room like a hawk scanning for danger. And then there was Hastiin, the quiet one. He moved like shadow, his presence somehow both unsettling and calming at the same time. Eliza kept her rifle within reach, but forced herself to act as host. "Sit by the fire," she said, gesturing to the hearth. "There's stew if you're hungry." The men exchanged glances before settling near the flames. They spoke softly to each other in their own language, words that flowed like a river over stones, foreign yet strangely musical. Eliza ladled stew into wooden bowls and handed them over, careful not to let her fingers brush against theirs. Kohana ate first, his gaze never leaving her. "You live here alone?" he asked between bites. Eliza stiffened but nodded. "Yes." Tseena smirked. Brave for a white woman. The words could have been mocking, but something in his tone made it sound like respect. Eliza didn't know how to respond, so she busied herself with the fire. Outside, the storm unleashed its fury. Rain hammered the roof like 1,000 tiny fists, and wind screamed through the cracks in the walls. The cabin groaned under the assault, but it held firm. Hours passed in uneasy silence. The warriors spoke little, but their eyes missed nothing, the way Eliza's hands trembled slightly when she reached for her cup, the way she glanced at the door whenever thunder shook the sky. Hastiin noticed most of all. He didn't speak, but once, when a particularly loud crack of lightning made her jump, he shifted slightly, as if ready to rise. Finally, Eliza could stand the quiet no longer. "How long will the storm last?" she asked. Kohana studied the fire. 2 days, maybe 3. 3 days. Trapped in this tiny cabin with 3 strangers. Eliza's stomach twisted, but she lifted her chin. Then, I suppose you'll be staying a while. Tseena grinned at that, but Hastiin just watched her, his dark eyes reflecting the firelight. And for the first time since they'd arrived, Eliza wondered if she'd made a terrible mistake or if this storm had brought something into her life that would change it forever. Second morning dawned gray and wet, the storm still raging outside the cabin walls. Eliza woke to find Hastiin already awake, crouched by the hearth as he fed small sticks into the fading embers. The firelight painted his face in flickering gold, and for a moment she simply watched him, this quiet warrior who moved with such deliberate care. Then the floorboard creaked under her weight, and his head lifted. Their eyes met, and something unspoken passed between them before he returned to his task without a word. By midday, the forced closeness began to wear at Eliza's caution. Kohana sharpened his knife with slow, rhythmic strokes near the window, while Tseena examined her few possessions with open curiosity, her mother's china plate displayed on the shelf, the frayed quilt draped over her chair. Normally, such scrutiny would have set her teeth on edge. But when Tseena picked up her husband's old harmonica and blew a single, warbling note, the absurdity of it all struck her. A laugh bubbled up before she could stop it. The sound seemed to startle everyone, including herself. Tseena grinned and tried another note, deliberately off-key this time. Kohana rolled his eyes, but set his knife aside. "He has the ears of a sick coyote," he told Eliza in a conspiratorial tone. Hastiin, still by the fire, spoke for the first time that day. "And you sing like a bullfrog." The unexpected jab left Eliza blinking. Then Kohana threw his head back and laughed, a deep, rumbling sound that shook his broad shoulders. Even Tseena cackled, tossing the harmonica onto the table with a clatter. Eliza found herself laughing too, the tension in her chest unraveling like a knotted thread. Later, as she stirred a pot of beans, Hastiin appeared beside her. He held out a small pouch. "For the food," he said. When she opened it, the earthy scent of dried sage and wild onion greeted her. Eliza hesitated. "I don't know how to use these." "I will show you." And so, as rain drummed against the roof, the Comanche warrior taught the white woman how to season a meal the way his people did. His hands were sure as he crumbled the herbs between his fingers, his voice low as he explained which plants grew near the river and which could heal a fever. Eliza listened, mesmerized by the quiet confidence in his words. That night, as they sat around the fire with full bellies, Kohana began to speak of his homeland, the endless grasslands where buffalo ran like rivers, the winters when snow clung to the mesquite trees like cotton. Tseena added wild tales of hunting antelope and outsmarting rival tribes, his arms waving dramatically. Eliza found herself leaning forward, caught up in their stories. When Hastiin spoke, his voice was softer than the others, but his words painted pictures all the same. He told of watching the stars from horseback, of how his people named the constellations not as shapes, but as stories. "That one," he said, pointing upward though the roof separated them from the sky, "we call the running wolf. He chases the 3 sisters across the night, but never catches them." Eliza thought of the stars she knew cold, distant things with European names and measured positions. Hastiin's stars felt alive. As the fire burned low, she realized something startling. She was no longer afraid. These men, so different from anyone she'd ever known, had become not just guests, but companions. And when her gaze met Hastiin's across the flames, something warm and unfamiliar bloomed in her chest. Outside, the storm continued to rage. But inside the cabin, something new and fragile had begun to grow. By the 3rd morning, the storm had worn itself into a drizzle. Pale sunlight seeped through the cabin's lone window as Eliza kneaded dough for biscuits, her sleeves rolled to the elbows. The rhythmic press of her knuckles into floury dough mirrored the turning of her thoughts. These days of shared meals and unexpected laughter had unsettled her in ways she couldn't name. Hastiin stood by the door, his silhouette framed against the gray light as he tested the weather. The way he moved, fluid as water, deliberate as stone, fascinated her. When he turned and caught her staring, she didn't look away. Something had shifted between them in the night, when he'd told her about the running wolf constellation. Now his dark eyes held hers with quiet intensity that made her fingers still in the dough. Kohana's voice shattered the moment. "We ride at noon." He stood by the fire, rolling his bedroll with efficient motions. "The village expects us." Tseena groaned from where he lounged on the floor, picking at a splinter in his palm. "Let the horses rest one more day." "The horses are fine," Kohana said. "It's your lazy bones that need resting." Their familiar bickering should have comforted Eliza, but instead a strange tightness formed in her chest. She wiped floury hands on her apron and turned back to the dough with sudden vigor. Of course they would leave. That was always the way. People came, people went. She'd learned that lesson long ago. Hastiin crossed the room in 3 strides. Without a word, he took the other end of the dough board and held it steady as she needed. His forearm brushed against hers, warm and solid. Eliza's breath hitched. "You could come with us." His voice was so low she almost missed it. The words hung between them like smoke. Eliza's hands stilled. Go with them? Leave her cabin, her land, everything familiar? The thought should have terrified her. Instead, something like hope fluttered beneath her ribs. Kohana and Tseena had gone quiet, watching this exchange with careful neutrality. Eliza realized they'd known this moment was coming. Perhaps they'd even discussed it. She looked around the cabin at the chinked log walls she'd repaired herself, at the hearth where she'd spent so many lonely nights, at the doorframe where she'd once carved her husband's initials. Then she looked at Hastiin, at the quiet strength in his face, at the way his presence filled the room without him trying. "Or you could stay." The words left her lips before she could reconsider them. A heartbeat passed. Then another. The only sound was the drip of rainwater from the eaves outside. Hastien's eyes searched hers. When he finally spoke, his voice carried the weight of a decision made. "I will stay." Tseena hooped, slapping his thigh. Kohana nodded once, as if this was the answer he'd expected all along. Eliza's hands trembled as she pressed them into the dough, unable to contain the smile tugging at her lips. Outside, the clouds began to break. Patches of blue appeared between the gray, and sunlight spilled across the muddy yard. The storm had passed, and with it, the life Eliza had known before 3 Comanche warriors rode into her world. As Kohana and Tseena prepared to leave, packing their few belongings with practiced efficiency, Eliza realized with startling clarity that she wasn't saying goodbye to them. She was saying hello to something new, something that filled her with equal parts terror and exhilaration. And when Hastien's fingers brushed against hers as he helped her carry the biscuits to the hearth, she knew without doubt that her solitary life had ended. What came next, she couldn't yet imagine. But for the first time in years, the future stretched before her, vast and unknown and full of possibility. Morning light streamed through the cabin window, painting golden stripes across the wooden floor where Hastiin lay wrapped in his buffalo robe. Eliza paused in the doorway, watching the steady rise and fall of his breathing. For 3 nights now he had slept beside her hearth, yet each morning she still woke half convinced she had dreamed his presence. The coffee pot hissed on the stove as she moved quietly about her morning chores. She had just begun kneading bread dough when a shadow fell across the table. Hastiin stood there, his hair loose about his shoulders, holding 2 fresh trout threaded through the gills on a willow branch. "Breakfast," he said simply. Eliza's hands stilled in the flour. "You went to the creek already?" The fish bite best at first light. He laid his catch on the table, his fingers deft as he began cleaning them with the knife she'd lent him yesterday. She noticed how carefully he handled the blade, how precisely he removed the bones. They worked in comfortable silence, Eliza shaping bread loaves while Hastiin prepared the fish. The domesticity of it felt strange yet natural, like a song she'd forgotten the words to but whose melody still lived in her bones. After breakfast, Hastiin stood abruptly. "Come." "Where?" "To see your land through new eyes." The morning air carried the damp richness of earth after rain as they walked the property boundaries. Hastiin moved like part of the landscape itself, pausing to point out things Eliza had never noticed: the faint deer trail hidden behind the blackberry thicket, the stand of wild onions growing near the creek bend, the old oak whose bark bore claw marks from a bear years past. "You watch but do not see," he said, not unkindly. He crouched by a patch of disturbed earth, tracing finger along tracks Eliza couldn't decipher. Rabbit came here at dawn. Fox followed. His hand hovered over a faint impression in the mud. See how the claws dig deep? The fox was running. Hunting. Eliza knelt beside him, her skirts brushing the damp grass. The world around her seemed to sharpen into focus: the whisper of leaves, the distant cry of a hawk, the earthy scent of the soil beneath them. How many years had she walked this land without truly knowing it? That afternoon, Hastiin took her hunting. He showed her how to move without snapping twigs, how to read the wind direction by watching the sway of spiderwebs. When a plump grouse burst from the underbrush, Eliza's shot went wide. Hastiin didn't criticize. Instead, he handed her his bow. "Try this." The weapon felt foreign in her hands, its curve alive with tension. Hastiin stood behind her, adjusting her grip with light touches that sent warmth spreading up her arms. "Don't fight the bow," he murmured near her ear. "Let it become part of you." Eliza drew breath, released. The arrow flew true, taking the next grouse cleanly through the breast. As they gathered their kill, Hastien's fingers brushed against hers. Their eyes met, and in that moment Eliza understood that he wasn't just teaching her to hunt. He was showing her how to survive, not just on this land, but with him. That evening, as fireflies danced in the gathering dark, they sat together on the cabin's porch. Hastiin pointed to the emerging stars, naming constellations she'd never heard of: the dancing children, the arrow that never falls, the laughing river that wound across the summer sky. Eliza listened, her shoulder warm against his, realizing with quiet wonder that for the first time in years, she wasn't lonely. The night air carried the scent of pine and earth, of wood smoke and the faint metallic tang of the arrowheads Hastiin had been sharpening earlier. Ordinary things made extraordinary simply by being shared. Inside the cabin, the fire burned low. Outside, the world stretched vast and unknown. And between them, something new and fragile took root, as tender as the first green shoots of spring pushing through winter-hardened ground. The first warning came on a market day. Eliza stood at the general store counter, sacks of flour and coffee stacked before her, when she noticed the stares. Women clustered like sparrows, whispering behind their hands while their husbands eyed her with hard expressions. The storekeeper, usually quick with a smile, counted her change slowly, his mouth pressed into a thin line. "Your friend didn't come to town with you?" he asked, emphasizing the word like it tasted foul. Eliza's spine straightened. Hastiin had work at the homestead. The storekeeper's eyebrows climbed his forehead. "Homestead, is it?" He exchanged glances with the man behind her in line. "Didn't realize Comanche took to farming." Laughter rippled through the store. Eliza's cheeks burned as she gathered her purchases, the coins on the counter suddenly feeling like a confession. The bell above the door jangled too loudly as she left. On the wagon ride home, the whispers followed her like ghosts. She caught fragments as she passed clusters of townsfolk: unnatural, dangerous, going native. A boy no older than 10 mimicked shooting a bow at her, grinning when his friends giggled. By the time her cabin came into view, Eliza's hands ached from gripping the reins too tight. Hastiin stood by the paddock, brushing down their mare. He took one look at her face and set the brush aside. "Trouble?" Eliza opened her mouth, then closed it. How could she explain the weight of those stares? The way the shopkeeper had touched the rifle beneath the counter when she mentioned Hastien's name? Instead, she held out a small paper packet. "I got your tobacco." Hastiin accepted it, his fingers lingering against hers. He knew she was holding something back, but didn't press. That was his way, patient as the seasons, letting her come to things in her own time. The real trouble arrived 3 days later. Eliza was in the garden when the dogs began barking frantically. 6 riders came up the road, their horses kicking up dust. At their lead rode Tom Wilkins, the same man who'd once offered to buy her land after her husband died. Eliza wiped her hands on her apron and reached for the rifle leaning against the fence post. Wilkins reined in his horse just shy of her property line. His smile didn't reach his eyes. "Afternoon, Mrs. Hart. Heard you've taken on help." Hastiin appeared silently at her side, his presence like a thundercloud. Wilkins' men shifted in their saddles, hands drifting toward their guns. "We came to make you an offer," Wilkins continued, pulling a paper from his coat. "Good price for your acreage. More than it's worth, truth be told." Eliza didn't need to read it to know the offer would be insultingly low. "My answer's the same as last time. This land isn't for sale." One of the riders spat tobacco juice into the dirt. "Ain't right, a white woman living with savages." Hastien's hand twitched toward the knife at his belt. Eliza stepped forward, putting herself between him and the riders. "Get off my land." Wilkins' smile vanished. "You'll regret this, Mrs. Hart. That redskin won't always be here to protect you." As if summoned by the threat, movement flickered at the tree line. Kohana and Tseena emerged from the pines, followed by a dozen Comanche warriors on painted horses. They made no sound as they formed a loose half-circle behind Wilkins' group. The color drained from Wilkins' face. He wheeled his horse, so sharply it nearly stumbled. "This ain't over," he snarled, but the tremor in his voice betrayed him. Eliza watched until the riders disappeared in a cloud of dust. Only then did she allow herself to shake. Hastien's hand found hers, steady as an oak root. Kohana dismounted and clasped Hastien's shoulder. "We came to hunt," he said, though his eyes were on the distant road. "Seems we found better sport." That night, the Comanche built a large fire in the meadow. The warriors told stories in their musical language, while Tseena attempted to teach Eliza a gambling game involving carved bones. Hastiin sat beside her, close enough that their shoulders touched whenever he leaned forward to correct her moves. As the flames danced, Eliza realized something with sudden clarity. The life she'd known before the lonely days, the empty nights, was gone. Whatever came next, it would be different. Harder, perhaps. But she wasn't afraid. Across the fire, Kohana caught her eye and raised his cup in silent salute. Eliza lifted hers in return. The stars above seemed brighter tonight, the running wolf forever chasing his sisters across the sky. Tomorrow would bring its own challenges. But for now, there was only this moment, the crackle of the fire, the murmur of voices, the solid warmth of Hastiin beside her. And it was enough. The first frost came early that year, painting the grass silver each morning. Eliza stood at the cabin window, watching her breath fog the glass as she traced the path of a rider approaching through the dawn mist. Not Wilkins this time, but a government man in a stiff black coat, here to deliver what he called final notice. The paper crackled in her hands as she read. Surveyors were coming. The land would be divided. Her claim, built with her husband's sweat and blood, meant nothing without the proper filings. The agent's eyes kept darting to Hastiin, who stood motionless by the fireplace, his face unreadable. When the door closed behind the man, Eliza let the paper fall to the table. "They'll take it," she said quietly. "All of it." Hastiin stirred the fire with a poker, sending up a shower of sparks. "Then we go." Just like that. No anger, no despair. Simply the acceptance of a man who had seen his people pushed from one land after another. Eliza's fingers curled into fists. She wanted to fight, to scream, to burn the notice in the fire. But the truth settled over her like winter's chill. This battle had been lost before it began. They spent the next days packing what could be carried. Eliza wrapped her mother's china in homespun cloth while Hastiin traded their few cattle for sturdy ponies. The cabin that had once felt so large now seemed to shrink around them, its walls holding too many memories to carry away. On their last morning, Eliza walked through empty rooms that echoed with ghosts. Here was the spot where her husband had carved his initials into a beam. There, the hearth where she'd spent so many solitary nights. The window where she'd first seen 3 riders emerge from the storm. Hastiin waited by the horses, his silhouette dark against the rising sun. Behind him stood Kohana and Tseena with their families, ready to journey west to lands the government hadn't yet stolen. Eliza took one final look at the cabin, then turned away. When she reached Hastiin, he held out his hand. She took it without hesitation. As they rode into the dawn, the wind carried the scent of snow and sage, of wood smoke and horses and new beginnings. Eliza didn't look back. The past was behind them now, and the road ahead stretched long and unknown. But she wasn't afraid. For the first time in her life, Eliza Hart was exactly where she belonged. The end.